Hi, thanks. I'm pleased to be able to present to the Special Committee on Cosmetic Pesticides. West Coast Environmental Law is one of Canada's oldest public interest environmental law organizations, and we've been using the law to promote a sustainable economy and to protect the environment for over 35 years. That work has often included working on issues related to the regulation of pesticides, including educating tenants and farm workers about their legal rights and in relation to pesticides, and pressing for a ban on the cosmetic use of pesticides. I'm a lawyer and not a scientist, and of course you can always ask why should I be even here giving you evidence? And of course you should be listening to scientists and to medical experts on issues related to the toxicity and risks of pesticides and the difficulties in evaluating those risks. But I'm going to present to you on the things that I know about, and that's looking at whether or not our laws and our legal system can effectively manage the risks of pesticides, and does, in fact, effectively manage the risk of pesticides. So I'm going to focus in my presentation on two main points. The meaning of acceptable risk under the Pest Control Products Act, the federal legislation that regulates the use of pesticides in Canada, and the regulation of integrated pest management under the Integrated Pest Management Act in British Columbia. Now, if you look at moving to the first point, the risks, the acceptable risks of pesticides and what's an unacceptable risk, if you look at the label on typical pesticide products, they clearly indicate that there are very significant risks associated with the chemicals that are contained in the pesticide. These are just a few fairly typical warnings taken from domestic pesticide labels. So these aren't commercial, they're not industrial, they are ones that could be used, that are used for cosmetic pesticide purposes. So why, I guess, is the question is, why does Health Canada approve these pesticides if they clearly recognize that there are risks inherent in them? The Pest Control Products Act sets out what the Health Canada is supposed to be doing in relation to looking at the risks of pesticides. They're supposed to only approve pesticides for use if the risk is acceptable, and that means that there's a reasonable certainty that there's no harm to human health, future generations, or the environment from the exposure or use of the product, taking into account its conditions or proposed conditions of registration. And that's quoting directly from the Pest Control Products Act. Now, when Mr. Lindsay Hansen spoke to this special committee, an official from Health Canada, he actually described this section a little differently. He's talked about the reasonable certainty of no harm to health, future generations, and the environment from use or exposure, and that part's correct. But he said, when used according to label directions. Now that is not actually the same as the section I just referred you to from the Pest Control Products Act. This slide comes from his presentation, but what he is doing is describing how Health Canada understands the test, but it doesn't actually reflect what they're supposed to be doing under the Act. It reflects what they do, but not what they're supposed to be doing. The actual test, again, then, allows them to take into account the conditions, the label conditions, but it doesn't allow them to assume that the label requirements are being followed in all cases. Nonetheless, that is unless they have reasonable grounds for believing that the labels are actually being followed. But the fact is, we have a number of reasons to know that the labels aren't always being followed. The most prominent label on, or requirement on all of the labels, or almost all of the labels, is keep out of the reach of children. There's obvious reasons for that. Children don't know how to use these products safely. And yet each year in Canada, there are 2,832 cases involving pesticide poisoning involving children under the age of 6. That's about half, or almost half. In BC alone, the figure is 180 190 children reported in the year that the David Suzuki Foundation, who did this report, we're looking at. So we know that children are being poisoned, that there are human health effects associated with these pesticides, and that the reason that those pesticides are, those impacts are occurring are in many cases because people are not keeping the pesticides out of the reach of children. We also know that there are conditions on the labels intended to protect children, such as this one on the king fruit and tree and garden spray, that is clearly intended to protect children, and yet which require either the pesticide user to have a high level of vigilance in terms of making sure children do not actually enter the treated area, or children to have a high level of obedience. I'm a parent myself of 2 young children, both under the age of 6. I can tell you that I would have to be watching them very carefully to make sure that they never entered treated areas. And I'm sure that anyone who has young children in their life knows the difficulty of being that vigilant. Even among adults, the situation is complicated. Statistics Canada tells us that 42% of Canadians are functionally illiterate and that they are not capable of reading and understanding complicated warnings or directions. The example for many of those Canadians actually are hazardous warnings related to hazardous materials that they're not able to address. And even if there was a higher rate of functional literacy among Canadians, the fact is also that labels are only available in French and English. And in a place like Greater Vancouver, where 42% of the residents have a first language other than French and English, there's reason to fear that there may be individuals using these pesticides who are not able to understand the full all of the requirements of these very complicated labels. In addition, there is evidence in the field that pesticides are actually having environmental impacts. These 2 labels relate specifically to keeping pesticides out of lakes and ponds and other aquatic habitat. But the fact is that in 2000, the Ontario Ministry of Environment looked at the presence of pesticides in a number of streams. I'm sure you will have heard about or will hear about this study from other presenters. They found that there were pesticides in a large number in most of the streams they looked at. And but what I want to highlight here is not simply the number of streams at which where the pesticides are present, but that in some cases, not a large number, but in some cases, the levels of pesticides actually exceeded levels that were known to be harmful to fish. And we shall also highlight that as a result of the cosmetic pesticide ban, those pesticides, those levels fell below the levels that were known to be harmful to fish. The one exception was permethrin, and that was the Ministry of Environment felt that was because there were various exemptions from the cosmetics pesticide ban that allowed permethrin to continue to be used. The point here is that pesticides should not be showing up in streams, in aquatic habitat, and they definitely shouldn't be showing up at levels sufficient to harm fish habitat unless the label requirements are not being followed or the label requirements are not sufficiently strong to protect fish habitat. And also, many of the label conditions are vague, they're unenforceable. In some cases, they require expert information that the typical user may not have. So things like do not apply when weather conditions favor drift. There's recommendations intended to protect the groundwater. There's requirements that users know whether soils are permeable and the depth of their water table. Clearly raising some issues around both the knowledge of the user and the enforceability of the label conditions. The Commissioner on Environment, the Federal Commissioner on Environment and Sustainable Development, criticized Health Canada for exactly these types of vague and unenforceable conditions in 2003, but it appears that despite accepting those recommendations, the Health Canada continues to adopt some questionable label conditions. So to summarize on the acceptable risks here, there are risks simply because even according to Health Canada's own science, based on the fact that we have good reason to believe that label conditions are not being followed, even when people intend to. This is not a suggestion of malice or some, even negligence. It's just that they are difficult to follow, accidents happen, and people don't always understand the labels. On the my second topic, the question of integrated pest management. Integrated pest management, in theory, sounds like a very good thing, and West Coast environmental law has actually recognized that in certain industrial contexts that it can be a useful first step in moving to reduce pesticides. It sounds very sensible. You prioritize the less intrusive, less risky pest control methods first, and move later to the other contexts. We don't believe that integrated pest management makes sense in the context of cosmetic pesticides. I've spoken to that, we've spoken to that in our past submissions to the Ministry of Environment on the issue. But here I want to concentrate on a legal point. BC's Integrated Pest Management Act, although it's called an Integrated Pest Management Act, does not actually prioritize the use of less risky pest control choices first. It describes the content of what integrated pest management involves, but not the how of it, how it's being done. So, for example, it requires the users to think about setting thresholds for when pests will be considered pest species. It requires them to think about human health effects, but it doesn't actually require them to use less harmful pesticides. It's a largely unenforceable concept as it currently stands, other than meeting basic content, the basic content requirements that I've referred to. There is, in fact, no real evidence that integrated pest management has actually resulted in a reduction of pesticide use in the province in those industries that have been regulated by the Integrated Pest Management Act. The province hasn't actually assembled data on pesticide use in the province since 2003, which is when the Integrated Pest Management Act came into force. They used to, prior to that, every 4 years, release data on the levels of pesticide use, and we're informed that they are trying to assemble some of that information now. But we've reviewed pest management plans prepared under this Act and apparently in accordance with integrated pest management principles since the Act came into force, and in general they do not prioritize non-chemical pesticide use over chemical use. There's very little direction as to how human health and the environment is to be protected in them. And or at least no consistent level of, I mean, there are some plans are better than others, obviously. And we are aware of a number of operations which did not previously use pesticides under the Pesticide Control Act, but which now are under the Integrated Pest Management Act. And so our view is that there may actually be an increase in pesticides used as a result of the Integrated Pest Management Act. And finally, I want to make it clear that integrated pest management is a complicated and difficult to enforce concept, even if the Integrated Pest Management Act was actually putting in place meaningful and enforceable concepts. It would require a lot of field work. It would require a high level of expertise to review the work. It would require access to information about what the levels of pest species were prior to the treatments. And it may be due to this that there's actually been no successful convictions. That's the blue line under the on this graph under the Integrated Pest Management Act since it was brought into force in 2003. And there's been a severe decline in the number of tickets even issued. And tickets are relatively minor penalties. The result, I think, is that were integrated pest management to be used instead of a ban on cosmetic pesticides, that there'll be more work for the government to do enforcing it. They will be called by members of the public frequently who are trying to figure out whether their neighbors, contractors, are using integrated pest management appropriately. It will actually result in the ministry having to mediate neighbor-to-neighbor disputes, or the government having to neighbor-to-neighbor disputes. And in our view, this is just not an effective use of government enforcement resources, which are already stretched. We would submit that a cosmetic pesticide ban is just inherently much more enforceable and more appropriate under the circumstances. This box just highlights the time period in which the Integrated Pest Management Act was in force, and you can contrast the difference in the level of enforcement between the two pieces of legislation. So in conclusion, Health Canada incorrectly and in a manner contrary to the Pest Control Products Act assumes that pesticide users don't make mistakes in reading labels, and the result is that we are at risk from these chemicals, even according to the Health Canada's own data. And secondly, BC's laws mandating integrated pest management simply do not provide an effective alternative to a cosmetic pesticide ban.